We started.
Welcome to Heritage Spinning and Weaving. I'm Joan Sheridan, and I'm going to share some of my favorite tips and tricks for knitting with you. I have been teaching a class called Knitting Boot Camp for nearly 15 years. And over the course of that, I've discovered that there are some basic things that sometimes get skipped over. So we're going to start at the beginning, and we're going to talk about gauge swatches and getting a sweater the size you want, um, what causes fabric to look a particular way, and a little bit about some of the tools that we use. So we're going to start out with the basic measuring of a stockinette swatch. Stockinette is the gauge that a ball band tells you. When you look at the ball band, it's going to say 18 stitches in 4 inches or 10 centimeters. That is done in stockinette stitch. It's not the pattern stitch that you're doing in your pattern, but it's a starting point for everybody. It's plain old ordinary stockinette stitch. And you all know what that looks like. That looks like that on the front, and on the back we see the ridges. So on this swatch, we are going to measure 4 inches in the center of the swatch. You can't measure 4 inches in the center unless you have a swatch big enough. So your minimum swatch size should always be 5 inches. And if you want an even more accurate gauge swatch, go as large as an 8-inch square. So what do you do with these swatches when you're done? Keep them. They can be extra yarn at the end. They can be the fabric that you take to the store to match buttons to. You can practice techniques on them, like picking up for a placket or buttonhole band. So the swatches are very useful. I like to have you measure your swatches in 2 ways. One, before you wash it, and 2, after you wash it. Our swatch here has been washed, and actually it's been sitting in a book for a number of years, so it's a little bit dense, but you'll be able to see what we need to see. We are going to use a ruler to measure. We are not going to use a tape measure. Why? Because a tape measure is flexible and a ruler is not. You also need 2 seaming pins or 2 T-pins. And you're going to put your ruler onto your fabric and center it so that your very first pin will go here. We're measuring rows, or I'm sorry, we're measuring stitches. So from here to here. And now we can take the ruler away. We don't need it because we know that this is our beginning and this is our end. And counting from my direction, where's my count pointer? We're going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So we have 20 stitches in 4 inches. So we're going to write that down. And we also, so you know, for your reference, this was knit with a size 7 needle and it's worsted weight yarn. So now we're going to turn it and we're going to count rows. Well, I find it much easier to count rows on the back side. So we will do the same thing here. And we're going to mark our row here. and here, and take our ruler away. I always use a handy needle to count. The nice thing about putting the pins in and taking the ruler away is that you can stretch the fabric. And look how easy it becomes to see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30. So we get 20 stitches and 30 rows this knitter did in this swatch. So that is how to measure a stockinette swatch. Let's look at differences in a garter stitch swatch. The stitch way isn't going to change, but the row way does. So we're going to do the same thing, mark our beginning and mark our ending. And we're going to count our ridges. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. However, each of these ridges represents 2 rows. So we really get 40. We had 22. We have 44 rows. Because when we turn it over, we see the same thing. We have where we have a valley on this side, we have a ridge on the other side. So it's a ridge, a valley, a ridge, a valley. 1 row, 2 row, 3 row, 4 row. So garter stitch is measured like that and a little bit different. Another thing that, as long as we're talking about garter stitch, is that garter stitch, the main characteristic of garter stitch is that you have a ridge, a valley, a ridge, a valley. You can make garter stitch in the round by knitting 1 row and then purling 1 row. And that gives you a ridge, a valley, a ridge, a valley. So if you're knitting flat, you knit every row, which makes the ridge move from one side to the other side. But if you're knitting in the round and it calls for garter stitch, you're going to knit 1 round, purl 1 round to get the same appearance as here in this flat knitted swatch. Some people find making swatches tedious. I hope that you can add them into your knitting repertoire so that they're pleasurable. You're still knitting, you're still making fabric, and you're going to make sure that the next 30 hours that you spend knitting that garment are going to be worth your time. It's no fun to have a sweater sit in the closet and you won't wear it because it doesn't fit. So let's talk about how we make that fit happen. You need to start with the pattern and see what it calls for as far as yarn and needles. And then you need to cast on for your swatch so you have at least 5 inches. How do you know 5 inches? Because you gauge it on the yarn and the needles and the yarn ball and the pattern. All the information is there. If it calls for 4 stitches in 1 inch and you want it to be 5 inches wide, all you have to do is multiply the 4 by 5 to get 20 stitches that need to be cast on. That's pretty simple. So you're going to knit until you have a 5-inch square. hopefully it's 5-inch, and then you're going to do your measurements. You are going to make sure that you use the same needles that you are going to knit your garment with. So if you are doing your swatch on double point needles that are bamboo, and you're going to knit on circular needles that are slick, shiny needles of some type, that's not going to give you a true gauge. You have to use the same needle when you do your swatch, when you knit your garment. Here in our shop, we use Chow, and it's really, they're really nice because there's a comprehensive selection of fixed length circulars and interchangeables as well. So it's really easy to have a nice collection that you can always use the same needles, the same kind, so that your gauges are accurate. There's a huge difference between a gauge on, well, maybe not huge, but there is a significant difference between knitting on slower needles than on faster needles. Whichever you knit on is fine, but you need to do the swatch the same. Same. So let's look what happens if we don't count our gauge swatch right. If in our gauge swatch we measured 20.5 stitches in 4 inches, we need to figure out what that translates to according to our sweater pattern. If we're making a size 40 sweater, that means we have 10 sets of 4 inches in our 40-inch sweater. 4 inches times 10 gives us 40 inches. So if we calculate 10 times 20.5, we get 205 stitches. Well, if our pattern only called for 20 stitches per 4 inches, we multiply that by 10, we get 200. So we have a 1-inch difference. So our 40-inch sweater is now going to be 41 inches. And if that matters to you, then you need to adjust your needle size, your knitting style, which is harder to adjust than your needle size, but or reconcile that your sweater is going to be an inch larger. Now that's not a huge difference, but sometimes it can be a big difference. So measuring your gauge swatch accurately is really important. So once you've done your calculations and you're comfortable that your gauge matches what the pattern calls for, then it's time to cast on for your garment. After you have knit 3 or 4 inches, you're going to want to check your gauge. If you started with ribbing, you probably want to check it a couple 2 to 3 inches above the ribbing so that it'll have a chance to expand a little bit. So you want to take your, get your fabric on long needles, and that's when interchangeables come in handy. You can put an extra cable in there, add it to your circular, and really spread out your piece. And this is when it's important that you have measured your gauge swatch before you washed it and after you washed it. So you're going to compare this to your before washing sample. So compare, make sure you're getting what you should be getting. I had one student that cast on, didn't measure, got to the armholes, and she brought it into class and she said, "This sweater is going to fit me and my husband at the same time." Well, that's a problem. I said, "Well, why didn't you stop?" She said, "I thought it would get better." Trust me, it doesn't get better. So you need to get a hold of this early in the game. So that's the second time, after your swatch and after you cast on, the next time you check your gauge is when you've got a certain amount of fabric on your needles. Very important. There are 3 ways to knit swatches in the round. One is to what Shetlanders call break and eke. We break the yarn at the beginning and ending of every row. And this simulates knitting in the round because we knit every stitch. So we knit, and then we slide it to the end of the needles, and we knit again. Actually, we slide this way. You can also do basically the same thing, except carry your yarn across the back so you have a big loop. Or you can cast on enough to do a swatch actually in the round. I call hats swatches. So I'm swatching for a sweater right now, and I'm on my second hat, and I'm looking more at colors than at gauge because I know my gauge in stranded knitting. But you can be creative with your swatches. You can make a pair of socks. It doesn't have to be a swatch that does nothing, but it could be something. Hats, the size really doesn't matter that much. A very important part of knitting is learning to read your knitting. When you can read your knitting and understand how the yarn moves through the row, now you can fix your mistakes so much more easily. So, at the very basic, a stitch looks like this. This is the full stitch. On the front of your fabric, you see a V for a stockinette stitch. So if you can follow this, you know what a stitch looks like. So let's look at a little swatch I have. This is part of our knitting boot camp program. And I have a swatch that has garter stitch. Well, let's look at the proper side. Garter stitch, stockinette stitch, ribbing, and seed stitch. And the interesting thing about this is, here's our V's. You can see the V's very clearly in the stockinette section. You can see them pretty clearly in the 1-1 rib. But if I pull this apart and you look very closely, you can see what I drew on the paper in the stockinette stitch. But wait, if I do the same thing with the garter stitch, you see that same thing. Look here, it all goes down the row the same way. Little bit contorted, but the same undulating pattern goes down the length of that row. All the stitches are on your needles the same way. The right side of the stitch is always on the front of your needle, and the left side of the stitch is always on the back of your needle. For most people, some people knit different than that, but by and far, the biggest number of knitters knit so that the right side is on the front and the left side is on the back. So it doesn't matter if it's garter stitch, stockinette, or ribbing, you still have the right side of the stitch on the front of your needle. So let's look at some fabric. And we're going to start by looking at a piece. Lisa, can you get up here and see that real close? And look for the inconsistencies in the rows. Do you see that some of the stitches look bigger? Some of the rows look bigger than others? The height of the stitch, can you see that? Okay, it's really easier to see on cotton when that happens. And if we look at the back side, can you see the pairs of rows? Well, the rows where there's a bigger gap, that's your purl row. And on your purl row, we tension the yarn differently I think that it has to do with dominance. Pushing away, you can push harder than you can pull toward you. You're weaker as you pull toward you. And when, you can come back to me, when you bring that pearl around, you're not pulling as hard. You're getting more yarn in that stitch that goes over your needle, the right side on the front, the left side on the back of your needle. And you get the ridges. Like I said, it's more dominant in cotton. It happens in wool. And if you look at the back of yours, you can check how good your knitting is, how consistent your knitting is really a better way to describe it. And in a minute, I will talk about how to fix that problem. So this is a sample that is a pretty good sample. The V stitches in the rows, you can see them clearly. They look like true V's. So this is a high quality yarn made for general family knitting. Okay, let's look at another one. This is also a high quality yarn. It's Sublime Merino DK. But if you look at this, you might need to look at an angle. You can see that this column here kind of looks like a rope going up. And the other side of the V goes at more of an angle. So we have one that is tightly twisted and one that is loosely twisted. And it makes our knitting look, here's another sample, more dominant here. Tightly twisted, loosely twisted. These look more like hash marks. This is more like a rope, all twisted. So when this happens to you, don't feel like it's you and your knitting. It is the yarn. This sample is a single. So there are no plies in it. It is just one single yarn that has been twisted. When that happens, we get often too much twist. It's just characteristic of a single. There has to be enough twist to hold the yarn together, and it shows up in your knitting as this tightly twisted one side and loose on the other. It is just the nature of the beast. The Sirdar has many plies in it. There's lots and lots of twist in this yarn. And the twist has to go somewhere. And it comes out in the knitting looking like this. So don't hold this against yourself. There's no way you can get rid of it. It just is. This magical swatch is going to show us a number of things. I'm going to show you how to use the needles that you purchase. I'm going to show you, talk to you about selvages, and we're going to learn about how to count cables. And if you've never done a cable before, you'll be able to see that done. So let's get Lisa, my photographer, over here so you can look over my shoulder and see how things are moving. So let's talk about selvages. Selvages are the edge of the fabric, and when they're exposed, we want them to look nice. When we're making a scarf, we use, such as this, we use border stitches, and that will help the stockinette fabric lay smooth. Here in this scarf, we used a seed stitch to help make the fabric lie flat. Stockinette likes to curl, so we need to do something about it. When we are making a sweater, we don't want to do any treatment to the edge. We want to have when we make a scarf, we want to have a nice, neat edge. can you see how this looks like a chain? And when we do that chain, we get holes at the edge. You can see that when I pull it apart. And that's fine for a scarf, but it's not fine for a garment that we have to seam. So if we look here, we have little nubs, and that's the yarn as it comes around the end of the row. And you can see that we don't have gaps here like we do here. So this area is what we want to use for a seam in a sweater, and this is what we want to have for a scarf. So the question is, how do we make these different edges? In the stockinette section here, where I have the little lumps on the edge, I knit one row, purled one row, knit one row, purled one row. Here and here, where I have a nice little chain up the edge, when I started each row, I looked at the stitch that was on my needle, and if it presented to me as a knit stitch, I slipped that stitch as if to knit with the yarn and back. On the wrong side, it presents to me as a purl stitch. So I bring the yarn to the front, slip that stitch as if to purl, and continue the row. And that gives you this nice little chain edge. So the important thing is, how does that stitch present itself? If it presents as a purl, slip as a purl. If it presents as a knit, slip as if to knit, and then continue the row in pattern. And that's what you want to do for something where the edge is exposed in the garment. So let's work this piece across, and I'll show you how to slip the first stitches. So I see it as a purl. There's a bump in front of me. So with the yarn in front, I am going to slip, take the yarn to the back, move it to my right needle, and work my next stitches are knits, and purls. Okay, I have a set of 8 stitches here that I need to knit in stockinette, so they're knit 8 stitches. But I want to point out something that you may or may not have noticed when I was working the other stitches, and that is I push my stitches down to the slopey part of the needle. So I want to work my stitches on this part of the needle. So push them down, wrap. Now I bring it down to the full barrel of the needle. Watch this again. And what is happening here is that the stitches are being measured to be, the yarn is being measured to be the size of the knitting needle. If you form your stitches, now I'm on purls, but it doesn't matter. If you put your stitches down here because you're afraid you're going to lose them off the end, and you go in like that, can you see how that got stretched? See how big that stitch is? So if I reform that, yarn to the front, tips, slide to the full barrel, tips, slide to the full barrel, and 4 knit stitches to end. But see how close I'm working to the tips there. I'm also holding these stitches so they don't come off with my pointer. Okay, So let's turn it around the other side, and we're going to look, and we're going to see that again, it presents as a purl. So we're going to do the same thing. And that's our slipped stitch. Okay, go ahead. I call this method of knitting on the cliff. It's so important that when we go to the store and we buy a size 8 knitting needle, which this is, and I use it so that I get a stitch that is 5 millimeters in diameter. That's what we want. If we put 2 5-millimeter ends into one stitch, it's easy to see that it's not going to be 5 millimeters around anymore, and it's going to be stretched, and you have given control to your knitting. You didn't take control. So I want you to take control and be in charge of your knitting. Now we are going to look at cables real quick. So one of the things that I find about cables is that you get going, you're knitting along, and then you go, oh no, how many more rows do I need to knit before I do my next cable crossing? Well, in my pattern here, I'm doing a cable crossing every 6 rows. So it looks wide here, and it looks like it's about time to do my cable, but I'm not 100% sure. So here's what we do. We're going to look for the hole where the last cable was made, where we crossed our threads. We're going to take another needle and put it under the fabric and come up between the right stitch on the cable and the reverse stockinette part. Okay. So I've inserted my needle, and I can very easily count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I said that I'm making my cross every 6 stitch. So let me do that. We know that we start with a slip stitch. Yeah. Now we're to the cable. And for those of you that have never done a cable, you're going to see that it is amazingly simple. Our cable uses 8 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We're going to take these 4 and slip them to a cable needle, or in my case, I'm just using a spare circular, and we're going to hold them at the back, and we're going to knit them out of order. We're going to knit these next. Slide the ones that we put on the back, and we're going to knit those. It doesn't matter that the needle is smaller because the stitches have already been made the size of the needle. And we end with 4 knit stitches. And then we'll take a look and you can see how it looks. Okay, so now we've got our cable forming, and you can see how easy it was to do that. And you can see where we went. Here's our next opening. There's our 6 rows. So if you ever have any questions about the cable below in your fabric, you can check it even after you've worked past it. I thought I would show you how to knit with 2 colors, one in each hand for Fair Isle knitting. This week is Shetland Wool Week, and there's been a lot of buzz on the internet about Fair Isle knitting. So this is Fair Isle knitting that I'm working on. And the first thing I'm going to start off with is a tip that I have learned, and that is leave yourself slack in your yarn. If your yarn gets tight and you pull it, it'll change your gauge. So if you're pulling the same loose yarn, you'll get a more consistent gauge. So I am going to, so you can see it from that side. And we'll have Lisa come over and stand behind me so that you can see it from over my shoulder, how I'm holding the yarn. So you'll notice that I tension my yarn in a mirror image. I normally knit with my right hand, but I can knit continental style quite easily. But I taught myself how to work with 2 hands. Not difficult, but it made sense to me that I must have tensioning. Just like on a sewing machine, you have gears that or pulleys actually, that you have to go over. And that helps keep tension on a sewing machine. It helps keep tension in your knitting. So if I just let it go loose and hang like that, I don't have control over the tension as I do when I'm using my hand to provide resistance. So, mirror image with the tensioning. And by keeping one yarn on each side, my yarns never ever tangle. On my left, I have my pattern yarn, and think of it as using a pen on a piece of paper. The pen provides a pattern. It might be letters, it might be just something you're drawing. So the left yarn is making what is happening here is the bottom of a flower. You can see here, this is the motif. This is what I drew with my knitting yarn. And you can also see, if you look close, that the blue stitches are a little bit bigger. It especially shows up in the middle than the background stitches, the tan. I carry the background yarn in my right hand. And what happens on the back of the fabric is that the foreground yarn in my left hand is carried at the bottom of the row, and the background fabric is carried at the top of the row, and that's one row. So we've got the close to the needles is the background, not close to the needles is the foreground. So that juxtaposition helps create depth, and it helps our pattern show better. So yarn management is really important when you're knitting in Fair Isle style. Not all stranded knitting is Fair Isle, and you can read about that and learn the difference. But this hat is a traditional Fair Isle motif, and in fact, this hat is a swatch for a sweater that I'm working on. I've taken my magical swatch, and I have mistakes. And I want to show you how to fix them. I have a mistake that's in the reverse stockinette area, and you can't see it very well, but I have another mistake here where this is a slip stitch. So I am going to show you using this awesome needleworkers tool that we carry in the store. And the tool has a crochet hook on one end and it's like a dental pick on the other end. I use the dental pick end to help untangle yarn, pick out knots, and this end is used to rescue stitches. So we're going to rescue stitches now. Well, this is the right side of the fabric. Our mistake here is in the reverse stockinette area, and we always fix mistakes from the stockinette side of the stitch. So we're going to turn this over, and I'll pull out another one so you can see that this is not scary. I'm going to put my crochet hook into the loop that I have my run going down to. I'm going to put my hook under, turn it, pull it through. For crocheters, this is a pretty natural motion. Now this crochet hook is a little bit small for this weight of yarn. It's split a little, so you have to watch that. So under, turn, pull through. Under, turn, pull through. And now we have to remember that our stitch is a V, and it looks like the stitch that I drew on this sheet of paper. And I want to get the left side on the back of the needle and the right side on the front of the needle. So I'm just going to set it on like that. Now I'm going to move back down to my other mistake. And my other mistake is here. This stitch actually belongs to the row below. And if I look at the stitch on the needle, I see that it looks smooth. That's the stockinette side. But if I look at the other stitches next to it, I see bumps. So that means I need to have a bump here. So my stockinette side is actually on the other side. So I am going to put my hook in, grab the yarn, pull through, and now I have a bump just like the others. So if I had dropped that stitch down, made a mistake farther down, I would actually switch from side to side, because this is garter stitch and the stockinette portion happens every other row on every other side. So garter stitch, you have to work from side to side to side with every row. Stockinette, you just scoop it up from the stockinette side, not from the bumpy reverse stockinette side. So I'm going to leave you with a couple tips. One is that the locking stitch markers should always be stored open, not closed. Whoa, not closed. Store them open so they retain their springiness. These have been out for a number of years, and they're made by Clover. And Clovers, in my opinion, are the best. They last the longest, except for the ones that we always throw on the floor, of course. But they have come out with a new one, and it has a bumpy pin part to it, and it's finer. I really like this in my Fair Isle knitting because it's a finer gauge. The bigger stitch markers are really good for larger gauge. So what else do I use stitch markers for? I use them to mark if I'm doing decreases or increases up an arm. Every row that I put an increase or decrease, I leave a stitch marker, and then I can count. If it said decrease every 4 rows 8 times, I can count until I have 8 stitch markers hanging there. It's so much easier to pay attention that way. I also use them to mark the right side of my fabric on fabric that it's questionable, like garter stitch. You don't really know which side is the right side, and you want to make sure you do all the correct things on the right side. So I put a stitch marker on the right side of my fabric, and I keep it close to the right end of my rows and near my needles. I move it up every few rows. Also, another thing in my toolbox is this cute little heart. And this cute little heart is a gripper that makes, here we go, that makes interchangeable needles. Wrong one. Oh, wrong one. Okay, I'll start with the... Another favorite tool is this cute little heart. It's rubberized and sticky, and I use it for changing my interchangeable needles. If you have problems with your needles coming apart, these needles made by ChiaoGoo have a hole in them, and in that hole you put a T-pin wrench and you hold it, and then you twist with the heart sticky, and they won't come apart. Love, love, love my ChiaoGoo. I can't say it enough. And if it sounds like a commercial, it is, but I'm very evangelical about them. Whether it's the fixed length or the interchangeables, they make my knitting life easier and better. My stitches are better because the tips are nice and sloped, and I can make the stitches. I have a nice long tip where I can form those stitches. Okay. Two things that should be in every knitter's toolkit. Maybe you don't carry them around with you, but they should be by your knitting chair. One is the Knitter's Book of Finishing Techniques. See, it's got my name on it. I don't want this to go away. I have read this book from cover to cover and have stuff stuck inside. I use it all the time. The nice thing about this is that it gives you a photograph, it gives you a drawing, it tells you about it and when you use it, and it tells you how to work it, but it also says when you should, what's good about it and what isn't good about it. There are times that you shouldn't use this particular raised increase. So this book covers the basics. One of the things that it does really well is talk about seaming. And your seaming can make or break a garment. When you read this book and apply what she talks about, you're going to have a seam that looks like this, that you can't tell where the seam is. And it's just so satisfying to see that happen before your eyes. The other book that I like, because actually there's a newer version out than this now, is the Vogue Knitting, the Ultimate Knitting Book. And you have to understand how this book is written. It's collected from the pages of Vogue, and not all of the things are written in the same voice. And sometimes you have to read it through and play with it a little bit, but it is just chock full of techniques and stitches and how to do blocking. And then when you get to the very back, you can see I have lots of stickers in here. We have patterns. So this book is indispensable. It's good to thumb through. It's not something you sit down and read cover to cover, but you'll learn new stuff in here. There's a lot of cast-ons and bind-offs, how to do a yarn over between a knit stitch and a purl stitch, things that you don't come across all the time. I am passionate about knitting, and I want you to love it too. Making a swatch isn't a pain, it's a pleasure. Sewing a seam when you do it right is exhilarating. I hope that you get to your point in your knitting when you see it that way too. Studying these books that I showed you will help. Being around other knitters helps. Taking classes helps. And keeping your eyes open. And don't be afraid to ask somebody when you know they made a sweater. Ask them how they did that. What did they do for that cast on? Learn more. Be constantly learning, and your knitting will improve. Heritage Spinning and Weaving is celebrating 20 years in business this year. We're a brick and mortar store in Lake Orion, Michigan, and we have classes both online via Zoom and in the shop. You can check our class schedule at heritagespinning.com. If you have questions that you'd like answers to, you can find us on Instagram and Facebook. Heritage Spinning and Weaving on Facebook and Heritage Spinning on Instagram. You can also check my webpage, joansheridan.com. At our store, we specialize in Fair Isle knitting, Norwegian knitting, Krokbrog weaving on the Inkle loom, and general weaving. We also have yarns for the family, and sock yarn, and just about any kind of pretty yarn you can imagine. We have all of the Jameson Spindrift colors. That's about 225 colors, and they're all on our website, and you can order them there.